Here's example 1. And example 2. Unbelievably, those are the exact same mix, just with one key difference: bus processing. That is processing groups of tracks together and treating them like a single unit. For example, I can group all my drum tracks together in the drum bus and process them as though they are one single unit. On this drum bus, I have a parallel compressor, which mixes a very compressed signal together with an uncompressed signal. And then I have 5 different types of saturation. I use this same technique on my synth bus, my vocal bus, and on the master bus, which is all the tracks grouped together. But just popping some effects on your buses doesn't necessarily mean you're gonna get a better sounding mix. So this is how I think about it. This video is going to be a little bit more technical than some of the other ones, but it will give you the tools to have mixes that compete on a professional level. So, not a bad deal if you ask me. I want all my mixes to be a nice, fat, caked up brick chunk, or as human adults typically call it, loud. A loud or compressed mix is when all of the sounds have a fairly similar intensity. If you think of like a top 40 song, the vocal is like huge and like right in front of your face. All the other sounds are also like impossibly large. That comes from loudness. A very uncompressed or dynamic mix, like maybe an orchestral recording, usually makes you want to turn up the volume a little bit so that you can hear those quieter sounds. Loudness is accomplished mostly with saturation, compression, and limiting. These all have one thing in common. They shear off the peaks of a waveform so that the quietest part of the waveform can be made louder relative to the loudest part, so that the whole sound can be made louder. That's great, but there's a challenge. It's really easy to overdo it. Too much saturation and your sounds get blown out. Too much compression and they sound bitten down upon. We need to layer these effects over and over again so that we can build up the loudness in the mix. We don't want any one of our effects doing too much of the work. This is where bus processing comes in. I can work on any individual sound, and then I can work on a group of similar sounds, and then I can take those larger chunks of the mix and make the whole mix sound nice and loud by using effects on the master bus. If I want my mix to be a nice, fat, caked up brick chunk, I also need the overall EQ of my mix to be nicely balanced. If one range of frequencies is too loud relative to the other ones, it will steal headroom from my mix. If my bass is too loud, the rest of the mix has to get quieter to make space for the bass. Just like with saturation and loudness, a balanced mix requires coordination between the track, bus, and master bus. Each layer of the hierarchy is a chance to shape or balance the mix, or fuck it up. There are 2 ways that I achieve balance in my mixes. One is good arrangements. Every musical element has to have a purpose, and it has to live in its own space. This is a whole topic on its own, but think of this. If you have to make a big cut to clean up a mix that you produced yourself, it probably makes a lot more sense to go back and just fix the arrangement. The second is tone shaping using saturation. There are so many different types of saturation out there that can profoundly change the spectrum or tone of any sound. I almost never use EQ for this type of tone shaping or balancing because it's not necessary, and in comparison to saturation, it sounds pretty sterile and lifeless. Check out how much I can change the color of this pad that I made with the U-Synth just by changing the settings on the saturation. Or how much I can reshape an entire bus using saturation. So I use bus processing to make my mixes into a nice, fat, caked up brick chunk. I use compression and saturation to build up the loudness across each level of my mix. Then I use good arrangement and saturation to shape the tone so that I can get the frequency balance nice and dialed in. One last pro tip for you, I start to add effects to my buses pretty early on in the production process. This way I can produce or mix into the bus. I think of it like creating a physical space for the individual sounds in my mix to occupy. Thank you for watching.